Well, Ben, welcome to the podcast today, my friend. How you doing?
I am fantastic, Keith. Thank you for having me. Thrilled to
It's,
be here.
you said that now. We haven't got to the questions yet. But
Oh, ask me again in 10 minutes then. We'll see.
that's right. Ask you in 10 minutes. We'll start out with my favorite go-to question for all my guests. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Okay, so Keith, I did some preparation for today because I've seen a few episodes of your great work. I knew you were going to ask me this, and yet I really struggled to come up with an answer, which sounds really bad because it sounds like what I'm saying is I've never been influenced or guided by other people. Definitely not true. I just think in reflection, most of the people that influenced kind of how I developed and grew were people that didn't just outright say, do this or do that. They led by example. Because I'll be honest with you, the first piece of advice I thought of was my dad telling me, don't take wooden nickels, which to this day, I still don't know what that means.
But you haven't taken it.
Well, that is one thing I can say. Thanks, Dad. Wherever you are, that's one thing that you said that I followed. But I will say this. How about as one anecdote? Maybe it wasn't a piece of advice, but it was something that really influenced me. There was a gentleman who I met early on in my career when I was working for the government, for the CIA. And I was a noob, didn't know a whole lot. And even then, this person who'd been working there for decades and was seen as the expert would always make sure to ask me my opinion on things. And I always felt so included and so appreciated. As the years unfolded, I found that some of the answers I gave him were really dumb because I was a new guy. I didn't know what I was talking about. So at some point I said, sir, I called him sir, why did you keep trying to include me? Like the things I was saying weren't always useful. And he said, well, grasshopper. So I called him sir. He called me grasshopper. He said, because you never know what you miss when you don't try to get everyone's perspective. And even though you were new, you had a different background and a different appreciation for things. I wanted you to know that your voice was important so that if we were going to miss something and you saw it, you spoke up. And my entire career, that has always stuck with me, is never underestimate the value of others' perspectives, diversity of thought. And the quiet people, always make sure that you're asking them what they're thinking, because sometimes they have really smart things to say. They just don't get a chance to say them.
I love that. And Jiminy Cricket on that, a piece of advice.
Yes, that's right. And then, so actually that's good, because then if I lie, my nose will grow and then we'll know how the show's going.
There you go. Exactly. So I looked at your background. Your background was fascinating. You've had a lot of different experiences. So kind of give us a little bit of your personal journey.
Yeah. Well, I want to emphasize too, I have had a lot of experiences. Most of the time, it's not because I'm being kicked out or chased out of the last place. It's because I'm making a choice to try something different. Rarely, I look, if anyone's watching this video, I do have a square head, but I'm not Frankenstein and I don't get chased by torch and pitchfork wielding mobs. But look, I grew up in a military family. I think we mentioned that, Keith, right before we started talking. I wanted to be, my dad was a Navy pilot. I thought that was the coolest thing. But unfortunately, at a young age, I found out I had type 1 diabetes, and that dream was gone, and I never really found something to really replace it until actually recently in my life. So I've always been looking for what's the purpose, what's the thing that I can do that's going to give me meaning and satisfaction. From grad school, I mentioned the CIA. I ended up working there for about 5 years, did some cool stuff. That was my attempt at public service and serving the broader community. Met some great people like the gentleman I mentioned. Got to be a White House briefer in the Obama administration, which was super cool. But at some point I thought, let me see what else is out there before I decide to do this for the next 30 years. And I ended up going to the corporate world. I was the first person in my family to do that. Everyone was either teachers or military. So I had no idea what I was doing. And I was doing great things, though. Really enjoyed them. I got to work with IT leaders as a consultant, and then nonprofit leaders, and then HR leaders, and then sales leaders. And from the ability to have connections with all these executives, these brilliant people, learned a lot about business, about leadership, about decision making, and eventually led me to the idea that, hey, maybe I should take my show on the road and see if I can impart all these great lessons I've learned to others. As a consultant, now I founded my own business, Depth Charge Consulting, where I do management, leadership, and communication support. And also, as you alluded to, published the book, How to Suck Less as a Manager, the first of hopefully many books, that is, not sucking managers, the first of many books.
I'm glad you clarified that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good. I saw your face. You were, I don't know. I'm like, no.
Yeah,
books.
Good. So I'm curious, when I write a book, something's inspiring me to do that. What inspired you to write? Was it that you had sucky managers, or what led you to write How to Suck Less as a Manager?
Keith, I have never had a sucky manager ever in my life. They're all no, of course they a lot of sucky man. I'm sure you have too, right? I mean, you've probably had a lot of good and bad managers.
No, because I work in the church. All my people were really awesome.
Isn't that funny? Like, but it's true too, because there's something to be said for mission-based organizations having really good leadership. Because I think one of the things that distinguishes really great leaders, and then of course we'll get back to the why did I write the book, but it's humility. And I think when you're working as part of an organization that has a mission, I think this is true too of the military, government, nonprofit. When you're a leader that really believes in that mission and it's more important than you are, you have the ability to take your ego out and your biases out a little bit more and to focus on things. So I'm thrilled to hear that your leadership journey was excellent.
Well, honestly, I was being sarcastic.
Never mind. Everything I just said was garbage, people. Turn off the podcast. Don't read my book. It's all
no.
wrong.
I think you're right about the intention of the leaders in mission organizations. Unfortunately, some of them still aren't. They could always benefit from leadership skills and development. So even though you have the right heart and the right passion, if you don't have the skills, you could be a passionate leader who does things the wrong way. I would love to say they were all excellent, but some of them just didn't take the time to focus on the leadership development skill part of it, but they still had the passion and the heart.
So that's a great segue then, and why the book? Because I'll say, look, there have been times in my career where I was not a great manager, but I always wanted to get better. What you're describing, and let's, look, we're generalizing. Of course, there's bad leaders everywhere, but if you are somebody who is humble, even if you haven't focused on the skills yet, you still have the ability to. And what I kept seeing in all these organizations I went to, and all these, both as an employee and as a consultant, literally hundreds, it was the same problems over and over again. And we've been talking about leadership and management for, I usually joke, 20 years, probably since, humanity began, and we haven't figured it out. There are a lot of leadership frameworks out there, yet we still have, according to a Gallup poll not too long ago, 82% of people in manager roles not having the core skills that you need to actually be a good manager. So that means 1 in 5 managers or less has the skills. What other job in existence is there where only 20% of people actually is good at their job? Maybe meteorology? I can't think of it.
Right.
So,
and when you're wrong, we expect you to be wrong. So.
Yeah, that's why you give me a range. Maybe it'll snow, maybe it won't. Thanks, guys. I had my shovel ready. But the point of all this is I kept seeing the same problems, and I kept seeing really smart people that were fixing them. And I wanted to learn from them and put all the things that I had learned into a neat package to help people today make really actionable changes to the way that they lead, not only for themselves, but also to make the people that work for them a little less miserable. So that's the genesis of the book.
I love that. I just got done with my doctorate on organizational change. And one of the things I studied in that change process is different types of leadership styles. I'm curious, as you wrote your book, did you also take into consideration that management styles impact your ability to be a leader that sucked less as well?
I love this question too, because it's really top of mind for me right now, because I'm expecting my first child here in a couple months. And one of the things I'm doing to prep is I'm reading a lot of parenting styles books. And what I'm finding is, I think this is true of leadership management too. You're the PhD, so you tell me. I know you actually have 2 titles in front of your name. I have 0. So I need to up my game here a little bit.
That's okay. I forgive you.
Thanks. Thank you, Reverend Doctor. You can call me, hey, I'm mostly literate despite having grown up in Florida. So I think I'll put that in front of my name.
Okay.
So thank you. So the way I see these styles, there's a lot of different frameworks that you can use. And in recent careers, I was a consultant for organizations that did a lot of coaching that involved helping people identify certain profiles that they might have for personalities or ways of learning or ways of communicating. What I always tell people after having experienced so many of these profiles and frameworks is that they're useful for self-reflection. Of which, look, I don't care if it's the MBTI or the communication styles or which Harry Potter house you are. If it's forcing you to reflect on why you think the way you do and why you act the way you do, there's some value to it. But if we look at the core of each person, we are too complicated and have too many variables to really neatly fall into specific lines. So as I did look at these profiles, I did incorporate a lot of discussion and actually make recommendations on some to think about for self-reflection. But my goal with the book too was also to equip people with the ability to self-assess and have some of the thoughts and questions to ask themselves to understand how to grow, where to focus and prioritize their time, and how to think about situations where maybe they didn't act the way they wanted to, or they had regret or weren't making improvement. So I think, yes, there are some we mentioned in there, but also I want to equip people with the ability to evaluate which system they also want to use. Hey, Keith.
I love that when you talk about the different leadership styles, but the self-reflection is really key in that. And I noticed when I was take all these different tests, the Enneagram, the DISC profile, they're helpful. But if it doesn't change how I interact with the people in my room, it really doesn't do them any good for me to know that, hey, I'm a high D, which could be all kinds of things. But how do you, let's get down to the heart of your book, because I want to talk about, if you're reading this book, you're picking it up because you obviously think that maybe you have some suckage as a manager and you want to do that less. So what principles do you help people walk through in this book to get them so they are effective? And that's really all of our goals. How can I be an effective leader in my company, in my sphere, in my household, and whatever I'm doing? How can I be more effective at it? So give us like some of the key things you help people identify to figure out how they can be more effective.
Absolutely. So there's 10 chapters in the book, each representing a core area of challenge that I've observed through the course of, as I said, a lot of the consulting I do. So it's just, what are the most common 10 issues that we run into? Everything from, I'm a leader who doesn't know how to deal with people that are different than I am and how to support them, to I don't know how to do recognition, which is something I was actually having a chat about the other day. It's something you really should be doing if you're a leader, recognize your people. So there's one hard and fast rule. How do I understand the things that get me emotionally dysregulated? I think at the high level, I'd probably break these practices into 3 categories. So one is communication. At the heart of any relationship between people, there's some kind of exchange of information, which when done right, creates fantastic connection. And when done wrong, really creates issues. This could be because there's assumptions baked into how we do our exchanges, or there could be biases baked into what I assume that I'm going to get from somebody under me, under my leadership. So communication. The second one is about planning. Unfortunately, you could be the best leader in the world, but there's a million things on your plate. And if you don't have the right priorities in mind, you might end up focusing on the things that are on fire, but not necessarily they're going to be the most important to the people on your team. What this tends to surface as is folks that'll work with a manager for years and they have a decent relationship, but they never actually get development or growth because they're too busy talking about projects and things that are popping up. So planning and being able to think about the needs and goals of the people under you. And then the first section that we cover, and perhaps most important, is about that self-awareness and emotional regulation piece. You know, we always talk about to be a leader, you need to be able to make connection and foster trust with people on your team. A critical part of being able to do that is understanding what motivates you and what causes you to feel the things that you feel, so that when you're confronted with a conflict or with a hard decision, you can take out things that are irrational and make the best logical decision that's influenced by your emotions, but also influenced by sound judgment and the interest of the people under you. So the 3 big sections: communication, planning, and self-awareness/emotional regulation.
I love your first one where you say, reason number 1 not to suck is you haven't bothered to be good.
Yeah.
Why is that? You know, think about, I'm a big sports guy, and it's been a rough year for my St. Louis Cardinals.
Sorry to hear that.
But I know so many people, I always joke about this, and even my own realm of expertise is, we are very happy to be slightly above inadequate. So why don't more people strive to be good? I know in my field, some of it is my striving to be good prideful and not humility.
Mm.
And I always push back is that God never told you it was okay to suck at what you do. So how do you deal with that in the business world?
I think there's a couple different reasons why people don't try. I absolutely agree with you. A huge one is ego. There's an assumption in many cases, hey, I'm already great at this. Now, if that's the kind of person you are, you're probably not going to be picking up this book anyway. So, we don't necessarily need to speak to that. But just know, no matter how great you think you are, I think, Keith, you said this really well a couple minutes ago, we can always get better. And it's always worthwhile to pursue self-improvement, self-development. So that's the one category. I think the other category is that the vast majority of people, remember I said 82% don't have the core skills, which still boggles my mind, but the vast majority of people, whether it's nonprofit, government, or corporate sector, are becoming managers because it's the thing that they're supposed to do next in their career and not because it's something they're passionate about. I had one company I worked with, a Fortune 500 company, about 5-6 years ago, that before it would allow people to become managers, asked them to do a rotation for a few months, trying out these leadership positions to see, is that a good fit? Is that something I want to do? And a startling number, close to half, after doing that rotation, self-selected out and decided they did not want to be leaders. Now, what is that? Why is that interesting in you? Well, first of all, if you know you don't want to do it, great. And you have a different career path that enables you to move up in the career, great. You're not going to subject people under you to your slightly better than mediocre effort. But a lot of organizations, again, across sectors, there's not an alternative path for somebody who wants to improve in their career and get more senior that doesn't also include some kind of people leadership. So what we end up with is people who are doing this because they have to and are not only not being prepared, but aren't necessarily feeling called to try to get really good at this part of the job that they're not super excited about. So I think combination of things, but once we as a broader ecosystem start recognizing that we shouldn't take it for granted that somebody who is a high performer at one part of their job is also going to be a really good leader, and we start to have separate career paths, we're going to start to see less of this suckage, I believe, and more people that actually are being principled about trying to get better.
I love that. Another thing I noticed in your book is you give practical tips. And one of those I've run across in my own field is navigate difficult conversations. A lot of times organizations struggle because we refuse to have that difficult conversation. If somebody is underperforming or they're not showing up like they should, the way they should, we tend to tolerate it because we don't want to have that sit down, hey, you're really not carrying your own weight or you're not doing this well. And then we let it go on for years and years and it impacts the organization. So what advice do you have or what tools do you have to have these difficult conversations?
I totally agree with your point. I think the inherent reason, and this will get to, well, how do you solve this, that people avoid these difficult conversations is because they're inherently confrontational. Anytime you have to pass judgment on somebody, even if your heart's in the right place and you're trying to help them, there's tension. And unless you're from New York, you're probably not going to want to have those conversations. And by the way, New Yorkers, my folks are from Long Island, so I feel like I'm okay saying that. So I covered Florida and New York. Who else can I offend by? I'm not going to offend St. Louis. I know we're already talking about the Cardinals.
You could offend California.
I just moved from California, so I think I offended enough people over there. But when we get to the heart of the difficult conversation, if you're worried about the tension, consider what are the things that are going to cause emotion in the person that you're speaking to, and what is your goal of the conversation? Most of the time, if we're having a difficult conversation, it's because the other person, usually somebody reporting to us, isn't performing in a way that we want or that's having the best possible outcome for our team. Start by focusing on what's objective and what's observable. Don't make assumptions as you build that case out. So for example, instead of saying, hey, you haven't been working hard lately, that assumes that you know the other person isn't putting effort in. In fact, they may be putting a lot of effort in or just really struggling to come up with the right results. Instead, you could focus on something like, hey, in the last 3 reports, I've noticed that satisfaction from our leaders has gone down. What's different in your experience with these that you think might be causing that? So be objective, be curious. I think the other piece is, as much as you can, start the conversation with something that anchors the person in security. Assuming that you haven't gotten to a point where this is a conversation about firing someone, And we can talk about those separately as well, because there are times when you're going to have that conversation as a leader. But if it's just a situation, hey, I need you to improve this performance, you can start with, hey, I'm about to have a conversation with you where we're going to talk about things that aren't fun. I'm going to have to give you some constructive feedback. But I want you to know before we start that I value you as a team member, and I'm really dedicated to working with you to improve this situation. Because whenever you're giving people feedback that something they did was wrong, it inherently makes us feel vulnerable and calls into question our value. But if you can secure the person that they have value and make them feel confident that you're not doubting their utility as a teammate, their inherent worth, just this one aspect of behavior that you need to chat about, it removes a lot of the possibility for escalation of emotions. So in sum, again, a few of the things that we talk about in the book that I'd say: be objective, focus on observation, be calm, focus on the emotions of the other person to help them feel secure, and don't make assumptions going in. Be curious and ask a lot of questions.
I love how you use the term constructive feedback as opposed to constructive criticism, because I've always discovered in my life it's never constructive criticism. It may be feedback, but criticism is never constructive or rarely constructive. I also know that, and you probably experienced this too, because you work with different cultures, that different cultures take feedback in different ways. For example, people who are from France are used to growing up in an education system that is very negative. So if they get a positive review, they elevate that more than we in America do. So if you give a review of feedback for someone who's from France and you have, like we do in America, here are 2 really great things you're doing, which really just kind of fluff. And here's a one thing that's negative we really want you to focus on. If you do that to someone who's from France, they're going to go, wow, I'm really knocking it out of the park. And that one negative thing they get out. So how do you talk about constructive feedback, keeping in mind that people receive that very differently depending upon how they grew up, where they're from, just their whole background about feedback and everything?
I love the question. And I'd even say, like, the situation you're talking about in France, or the French culture of feedback, or I would also say like German culture is like really, really dry. That happens within different companies, even within the same sector or industry. So I think there's always that kind of cultural lens to think of. My favorite example of this is, there was a time where I was working at a company called Challenger, which is a sales methodology company. And I trained 6,000 sellers myself and my team, many thousands over the course of a year. And when the key point of Challenger is that when you're talking to a potential client, you point out some of the problems that they might be facing in their business and novel ways to approach those problems. So you're not talking about your product, you're talking about the situation with your client. Trying to tailor that to especially East Asian audiences was very difficult, because the culture around criticism or really saying anything negative about somebody's business or conduct was very, very intensely different than what we might expect in America. I actually remember, I majored in Chinese in college, and my first textbook of Chinese language, like the 3rd chapter, was on how to say no, because it's considered rude to say, like, hey, do you want this? No. Do you want to go out Friday night? No. You're supposed to say, oh, let's think about it. Well, let me see, and I'll get back to you. You never say no. So I think it's a great point. My advice, so back to the point about the feedback, do your research. Don't make us, if we're talking about assumptions, whenever you go into a company and you start in a new environment, or if you're somebody coming from one culture to another culture, find peers and find mentors and stay curious and ask them, hey, what's the culture of feedback here? What's a typical review look like? Or even better, here's the review I'm thinking of putting together for this employee. I think they're really great. How does this seem to you? What impression does that give you? I think especially, at end of year performance review time, I would often ask my peers to read, if there's somebody I was trying to put up for promotion, or if there's somebody that I was trying to, advocate for a pay raise, I'd say, does this seem impressive enough to correlate to how I feel about the person? I think that exactly applies in a new culture or a new context. Be humble and ask questions, right? I feel like that's the advice for a lot of things.
Exactly. I'm curious, as you think about this book, what are some common mistakes you've discovered in your book that most managers make?
I think let's going back to the feedback one, is everybody avoids having feedback conversations. So let's say constructive feedback as opposed to constructive criticism. Nobody does it. Everybody avoids it. I would say that 82% number is probably conservative. One thing we didn't mention about having constructive feedback is you need to do it. Like, don't wait. The longer things happen, the worse they get. Much like with a family member or a friend, something they do bothers you. If you don't tell them, you build up resentment, and then everything multiplies. So do it. I think that's a common one. Another one that I see really commonly, believe it or not, is recognition. There's so many managers that just don't do it. And the reasons that they give usually aren't very good. If they're being honest, it's, well, I just didn't have time, I didn't get to it. Well, at least that's honest, but it's not a good reason, because I used to be a research director on compensation and benefits best practices. And executives would always be shocked when I said, hey, look, I know you're trying to give people raises. There are some things you can do that don't cost anything that actually make people happier than getting a raise. Like, just telling them they're doing a good job and you appreciate them. So in the recognition front, I would say number one mistake, not doing it. The second mistake is doing it really badly and saying something like, for example, hey, thanks very much. You're a great team member. We appreciate you. Now, be specific. Hey, on this project, you put in a lot of overtime and your efforts were really impactful. And here's why we know. Here's the customer satisfaction data. That gives them something they can use on their resume, that they can use on their performance review, and shows that you actually took the time and you thought about what mattered to them. So that's a really common one I see.
We all have been on teams that we wish we weren't on. So what advice do you have about people who've been on improving your team? Well, that's good. Okay. Because I was enjoying myself and then you disappeared.
Good. I'm glad. I was going to ask how things were going. So if it's been fun so far, things are great.
That's right. All right. I'm going to ask that question all over again.
Hey, I'll act surprised.
All right. So I'm curious, how you help managers deal with difficult team? And we talked a little bit about teams, and we've all been on those teams where it's like, why am I on this team? We're like, in sports, we're 0-13 and we have no chance of winning. But if you're the manager, you're called upon to fix this and make this team better. So what advice do you have of people who are struggling or difficult teams?
So difficult teams can mean a lot of different things, but it rarely means that there's an easy fix. I mean, it's in the word difficult, right? So I remember working with a client recently, and it was a relatively new manager that had 5 or 6 people on the team. 3 of them were high performers, hated the manager's guts, would constantly try to undermine them in public. The manager was, feeling bullied, crying at least once a week. And they said, how do I deal with this? I had to, in the end, unpack, as I'm coaching this person, almost every single person on the team's unique beef with the manager. They'd only been on the team 3 months, but all these people had these really deep-seated challenges. I'll give you an example. One really resented that the manager had been put on top of the team because they wanted to get promoted to the manager role, and resented having to go through an additional layer to get to somebody that they used to have reported to. Right. Well, in the manager's case, then, how do we deal with that? We try to set ourselves up as somebody that can be a proponent of that person's success, make sure they get the access they want, show that we're going to push their career. Okay, that's one person. Another person had an issue where they were competitive with the first person. So got mad because the manager was giving them extra attention. So how do we deal with that? Manager gives that person attention to make sure they feel supported. Somebody else was upset because they got put on this team unwillingly and felt like they had their rights stripped from them. So the manager had to work with them to come up with, hey, look, I value you and your career. Let's work together to figure out what next steps you want. So I give these as examples because throughout all of this, there's a lot of different conversations that have to happen and trust that needs to be built. That manager needed to do in the beginning to get to a space where they could do that is not take it personally, feel secure in themselves. They came to every meeting feeling under siege and embattled, and that they had to prove themselves. They were going to come out swinging, which is to some extent what they'd been doing, and it's understandable, but that was just exacerbating the problem. We had to work together to help that person feel secure coming in, that a lot of these challenges were not necessarily their fault. Didn't mean they were a bad manager, didn't mean they were a bad person, or a situation resulting from just the circumstances that led to the formation of the team. Helping that person feel secure then led them to a situation where they felt perfectly fine, letting the other people who were feeling competitive, who were feeling sidelined, speak their mind and take the spotlight instead of the manager. Putting an emphasis on, again, pushing other people's accolades instead of the manager feeling like they needed to demonstrate their own ability. Like if you're a manager, you're coming into a difficult team, find a way to make yourself feel secure. I think meditation's a great one, reflection, find a coach or a mentor, journal. Just know that you are not alone. There are a lot of managers, even really good ones, that end up in this situation. The key, you're going to have to untangle a lot of tangled emotions and challenges and assumptions and beliefs. The more that you can stay regulated as you do that, look objectively at the challenges you're facing, you're going to get to a resolution where your life's not quite as miserable.
I love that. Since your book is going to totally transform the managerial space, what do you see as the future of role of managers in the next decade?
It's interesting that the world we're in today, work is becoming more and more complex. So I would say 15 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, a manager, there was an expectation that they were also an expert in the work that the people on their team were doing and that they were going to have some direct role in it. And increasingly what I'm seeing, especially in big companies, but not exclusively, is that managers might not even have expertise in the things that their teams are doing. They're really good at navigating organizational complexity, making connection between different stakeholders that are needed to get work done, and dealing with leadership and process. I think we're going to continue to see that as the future unfolds. That prediction I made earlier in the conversation about having separate career paths, I think that trend is going to pick up a bit just as we start to realize that soft skills are needed. I do think we're at like a watershed moment now where the things that we considered fluffy before, like emotional intelligence, empathy, are actually vital to having a group of adjusted people. I think about work is weird, right? We're all strangers. We have to do work together. You couldn't be friends with a lot of your colleagues if you didn't have to work together. To be able to organize all that, you need to have a special touch and understand people. And it's not good enough just to be good at your job. You have to understand how humans think and operate. I'm hopeful, optimistic that in future we'll see an increase toward a very specific managerial role and a move away or a pivot away from being directly involved. Last thing I'll mention, because we have to, AI, just leave it at that. No, I'm kidding. I will say something. So what I'm seeing from AI, there's some companies I'm working with that are really fascinating and are applying AI in really interesting ways. And one of them, an example, teaches managers some of the soft things I was just talking about, like emotional intelligence, actually helping them understand, messages, emails, communications that they're getting, putting them in context of what a person is feeling or what they're seeking, and then giving suggestions, for example, about how to validate a person or how to support a person. We've only just started this journey. I also think that as we get a better sense of not only what's needed, how some of these tools can help us, I think training is also going to really evolve. So I bet you, Keith, in 10 years, when we have this same conversation about how to suck less as a robot or whatever next book I'm going to put out, it'll be a different playing field and managers will be a lot better.
I'm always curious, when you write a book, you always have some revelations you weren't expecting. What was the biggest surprise you got out of writing this book?
I started writing this just as a collection of observations about the things everyone was getting wrong and the things that I'd seen smart people, sometimes myself, do to correct those things. It was basically just, here are best practices, do this, let's make it useful and actionable right now. What really surprised me, both as I was writing it and getting feedback and after I initially launched it, is how much attention was getting put, the practicable approaches I put in there, to the soft skills. I didn't set out thinking I'm going to make this a fluffy book that has a lot of stuff about emotional regulation. I thought I'm going to give you an easy guide to being a better manager right now. But I'd had folks coming to me saying, I never thought about emotional regulation as an imperative, this thing that I really need to do at work. And I said, well, that's because you've never had a manager scream at you over and over again. And I certainly have. And I know it didn't make me have a great experience. So you really do need to be able to deal with stress, be an effective leader of people. This also gets to why I feel a little bit optimistic, because the time since I've had a lot of these conversations, I've also started connecting with some other luminaries and big data thinkers and scientists around how our understanding of the human brain and neurology is changing over time. That's, again, part of what informs my feeling that we're at this moment where we're realizing the skills and the training we've been giving managers up until now, things that focus on how to do a performance review or how to not harass people or how to fill out administrative paperwork, they're important, but they're not actually the things that make somebody good at management. We need to be able to teach people to be empowering and regulated and able to connect and foster trust. But that's what surprised me, Keith.
That's interesting. So I love to ask my guests this question. This is my other favorite question is, what do you want your legacy to be?
Oh, well, I guess that also depends on how long I have. I did think about this coming in. I think if today was it, there are some things that I look back on in my career that I'm very proud of that relate to how I helped other people either overcome an obstacle or find some better part of themselves. I've done some cool stuff. You can probably see some of the awards behind me. I put they're for show. But I got a National Intelligence Council award. That was pretty important when it came out. But if you ask me at the end of the day, what are you most proud of? I had a young man I was working with who had anxiety issues. His career was being held back because he couldn't handle extemporaneous phone calls with clients. He'd get too nervous because he's like, well, I don't know what they're going to say. And he would panic and he wouldn't be able to have these calls. And he was not being promoted as a result. I spent 6 months with him working on it and examining, well, why are you anxious? And helping him feel prepared. He got promoted. He did it. Years later, I talked to him, and it's a distant memory for him. And I think, he was super thankful for this. And I'm really proud of him, but I'm proud that I played a part in that. If I look, the future, and let's say I have some more time, which I hope I do, I hope it's that made people laugh along the way, helped create a little bit more happiness, contentment, and self-awareness in the world.
I love that. As you wrap up this phenomenal conversation, what key takeaways do you want to leave with the audience?
I'd say don't take wooden nickels. You talked about that at the beginning. I don't even know who's taking nickels. I feel now if I see a nickel on the street, I might not pick it up because it's probably very dirty and it could be wood. No, I think beyond that, look, if you pick up the book, which I'd love, I hope it's useful to you. I hope, I really respect you, audience members' time. If you're like me, you got an infinite number of things to do. You don't have time for somebody to lecture at you. You need answers quickly. And that was the intent behind the book, along with hopefully being a little funny. But even if you don't, do something else. Take the time to think about why you're acting the way you're acting, why you're feeling the way you're feeling. It sounds like a Mr. Rogers episode, but in a few years, we're going to understand that the root of a lot of the challenges that we have anchored in not understanding one another. That's kind of what we've been telling ourselves as a society, decades and maybe centuries. But in business and in the government and the nonprofit world, a lot of the conflict and disappointment and disengagement that we have comes from bad expectations, inefficient communication, and assumptions. If you can do anything right now just to self-assess and improve, please do it. And if you would like to take a look at a book that'll hopefully make you chuckle while you're learning, pick it up and maybe use that as your starting point.
So where can people find your book, How to Suck Less as a Manager, and learn more about you on social media?
Yeah, well, the number one place is Amazon. If you just go to How to Suck Less as a Manager, put that in the search. You can put my name too, Ben Arendt. You can also go to howtosucklessbooks.com. Which will also take you, if you're interested in learning more about some of the consulting I do, you can find links there as well. You can also see me. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, and I'm just starting as of about 3 months ago to get pretty active on Instagram, Keith. So I was not a big social media guy before, but now I'm just with the times. I feel very dated and embarrassed sometimes confessing this to both my peers. I'm not as old as I should be to say like, Instagram, but TikTok, no, that's too far. I can't do it. My brain will melt. Let's stick with Instagram for now. On Instagram, I'm at Good Better Ben. And on LinkedIn, it's just me, Ben Arendt. I would love for you to drop a line. If it's about the book, great. If you have your own ideas, listeners, about great management practices you've seen or terrible ones, or the next book, Keith, coming out early next year is on how to manage your career, how to suck less at career management. You think you have a really good practice, drop me a line. I'm always looking to learn more so we can help other people. find their equilibrium and not have to repeat the mistakes that some of us, including myself, had to make in their career. So that's my appeal.
I was hoping you were on TikTok so I could see you dancing on TikTok, but I guess not.
Nobody wants to see that. I've been told dance, my spine doesn't move when I dance. Like there's a pull. So I guess that you mentioned Jiminy Cricket. I basically just dance like a marionette. So you don't need to look at that. You can just picture it mentally. That is what you will find.
Well, Ben, thanks so much for taking the time to be on the podcast. And if you're watching the video, you can watch Ben dance and turn into your own TikTok viral video.
You know, why not? Keith, from your mouth to whoever's ear, let's make it happen, guys. TikTok viral video of me looking ridiculous.
Well, Ben, have a great day. Thanks again for jumping on and sharing. I hope people pick up your book and learn more about it and be better managers. We need less people sucking at their jobs. So we would encourage people to do that.
Man, Keith, thanks for having me.